Welcome to this episode of Phrasally Verbocious, where we'll be talking about the difficulties our students encounter in the classroom and what we do about those difficulties. Alan and I met, as we keep saying, in Spain. So lots of what we have to say are to do with Spanish speaker difficulties, and that can be extrapolated perhaps to other Latin languages. But hopefully the suggestions and remedies we propose in this episode can be used wherever you are in the world.
Yeah, one thing we probably should point out as well, that a lot of this comes from experience as well, especially when you're working in one country. Whereas I started off teaching pre-ESOL to mainly Arabic-speaking students, so we had a world of difference with issues coming from there with the Arabic language to coming to Spain with the Latin languages. So it's quite interesting when you go around the world, the differences in problems you encounter.
That's true, and I suppose therefore listeners will have different career trajectories, and if you work in one particular country, you become quite good, obviously, at knowing what they're going to struggle with. But if you're moving around the world, then you're going to encounter different problems, and you have to find new strategies. I'm going to launch straight in with a book recommendation, which is a book called Learner English by Swan and Smith. Unfortunately, it doesn't cover all 3,000 or however many it is languages of the world at the moment, but it does have a lot of really good information about some of the major languages and language groups that we might be teaching to speak English, and the problems broken down into things like grammar, into pronunciation, etc. So we'll put a reference to that on the show notes.
Yeah. Nice one. Well, since Chris and myself are based in Spain, I think one of our most fun problems, is fun the right word, Chris, is phrasal verbs in Spain.
Yeah. Well, phrasal verbs, can I just add to that? I mean, phrasal verbs are a problem for speakers of all sorts of languages.
They are, and I think that's what makes them most fun. When you're at L1, when your native language is English, basically, if you're of a language that isn't Germanic of origin, phrasal verbs are going to be an absolute nightmare. Now, funnily enough, I do find them great entertainment. And if there is any Spanish listeners, there's probably an audible growl right about now coming out of people. But I did actually look into the research recently of phrasal verbs and why they're so different. And what we're going to put in the research notes is a link on YouTube to Leon Green did a really good webinar on why English is so difficult to learn through Macmillan, must have been September, October. So basically he says English is created via 5 major points. So, for example, the Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic layer of the language that conquered the Celts back in about 500 AD. And then a couple of hundred years later, the Vikings invaded, bringing Norse influences. Then the Normans invaded, bringing the French influences. And then we went through a classical era with, say, like Middle Latin and Greek influences. And by this stage, 15th, 16th centuries, we're talking about having triplets of the same word already in the language. So if you think of kingly, which is Germanic, royal, French, and regal is Latin, right? So you have 3 words already. And then the British Empire had an influence in a lot of different languages, which obviously had an influence on its language as well. So phrasal verbs can be a mix of 5 or 6 different language bases already. And that's just a start. I love phrasal verbs, I really do. So I looked into a lot of textbooks on why researchers think phrasal verbs are very difficult. And if we look at some of the books, like the grammar book by Celsi and Muria, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and Larson Freeman, they basically say that phrasal verbs are a construction that's very difficult if you're learning it as a second language. There are very few non-Germanic languages that have them. And then there's a lot of other research from all around the world that basically says pretty much every language. So we have Malaysian, Indonesian, Chinese, Arabic, and most of the European languages that are non-Germanic have major problems with them. which I think is very entertaining, keeps us in a job. But one of the really interesting things when I was looking into this was if you look at, say, for example, the Collins Coe-Bill Dictionary of Phrasal Verbs, or say the Oxford Dictionary of Phrasal Verbs, it's only when the numbers hit you, you realize just how mental it is. So, for example, look at Collins Coe-Bill Dictionary, that's by Sinclair, if anybody's interested. They state that there's over 3,000 combinations of verbs with adverbs or prepositions, explaining over 5,500 different meanings, which is madness when you think about it. Because normally in a textbook, you have 8 at any one time, or 6 at any one time. I know. But the problem also lies, the Coe-Bill Dictionary was actually talking about, okay, so if you're, say you're A1 or A2, you come across a verb like make or put, out, off, and they're pretty common, right? So you have this correct understanding of the verb. It's fossilized in you because you know it's correct and you've been using it since A1.
Yeah.
But if you get to B2 level and you're given a phrasal verb or one of those verbs and a preposition, your brain's just exploded because you've been told, oh, everything you know is right, but also here's an entirely new thing using that same verb. I actually then looked into, all right, so the dictionaries are quite international because they sell all around the world. But then I looked into Irish phrasal verbs, and some of their meanings, like stuff that I would use.
Do you mean Irish? Do you mean Irish English or no English?
Yeah. Right. No, I'm yeah. So to pass out, well, you're Welsh. What does pass out mean?
Pass out to faint, or to complete military training.
Oh, okay, that one's new to me. Pass out here can be if you take over someone in your car.
No, that's overtake.
Yeah, but we can use pass out as well.
No, that's overtake.
I know. Yeah. So there's another phrasal verb in itself. In Welsh, what's let on? If someone is letting on.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying this is Welsh understanding, but if I use the word let on, that would mean to, I suppose, share some information, let on about something. Yeah.
Okay, so we would use it to pretend something. So if you're letting on, you're doing something. You're like, she didn't let on. She was angry, so she was actually angry.
Okay.
But the reason why that is also a problem, because like we've literally just mentioned different meanings of the same phrasal verb, is because they do change wherever you go. Make up, two very simple but two very low level words. Put them together, there's 11 different meanings for make up.
Yeah, depending on context and how it's used, right?
Yeah, I mean it's madness. So basically, as phrasal verbs are such a problem for non-Germanic languages, I don't think the best method is sticking 8 in a textbook page in the definitions through context, to be honest.
Really? What do you? So then, it's okay. You've told us how basically they are impossible. What do you do?
Well, I think you got to actually introduce them at a much lower level. So basically, what I do especially with the young ones, because by the time everybody's B2. You do mention them in class, and there is that audible growl you get out of people, which I think is fantastic. What I actually do is introduce them at a lower level, but introduce them in things like your daily routine. Because phrasal verbs start when you get out of bed in the morning. If you think about it, what's the first thing you do in the morning? Get up. Yeah. So you can actually have quite a lot of phrasal verbs before you even get to school in the morning.
I mean, that actually reminds me, if I can just put this in, I remember a former colleague of mine relaying a story about a student who, in desperation, a P2 student, was frustration and desperation. But do you actually use phrasal verbs, or are they just there to annoy students?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We use them the majority of the time.
Yeah. But see, I always say with my B2 or say C1 students, the trade-off is, we have phrasal verbs, but you have the subjunctive.
And they also have reflexive verbs, which each are.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So I think there is a trade-off eventually. But when I'm teaching phrasal verbs, I try to introduce it at much lower levels, because you'll find, I mean, I did a lot of looking into a lot of the textbooks we've used in the past, and it might be, you might see them, but they're never called phrasal verbs in lower level books. You might get them in like a B1 or B1 plus book, but they don't. It's probably B1 pluses where they sort of kick in. But I actually like to introduce them at a lower level. So say you're talking about the daily routine. I mean, at a low level, you always do your daily routine to practice, you know, a lot of different things. So why not, you wake up first, then you get up, then you look through your wardrobe, you put on some clothes, which of course the kids find hilarious because they think you're swearing.
In Spain.
In Spain. We tidy up our rooms, eat up breakfast, set off for school, meet up with friends in the playground. So you've got to the playground before school, but you've already done 8 phrasal verbs. So I kind of think, you know, useful sort of lexical chunks of your daily routine from a younger age, because then you see them and, okay, yeah, the correct fossilization of the use of these verbs is there, but they also understand, you don't even need to tell them it's phrasal verbs. You also understand, here's a useful thing you also do. You know, if you're leaving, I'm going to set off for the academy now, or, you know, going to eat up my lunch. And it becomes a lot more natural.
Sure. I think another thing to do, and this is something that I do with more advanced students, and actually maybe, and we've talked about the lower levels, B1 and B2, I kind of feel almost have to just suffer through phrasal verbs. But when
that's what it is, it's suffering.
Yeah. Well, I suffer through the subjunctive, so that's the way it goes. The higher levels, sort of C1 plus, start taking it all back to basics again, and we start looking at the fact that they can all mean so many different things, but also that often, you know, if you're being asked, what do you think a phrasal verb means, there is often some sort of concrete reason that verb has been placed with that preposition. Now, it might be a long way off or a long time ago that it had that concrete meaning, but they're not random words. They're not random verbs plus random participles. There's usually a little bit of sense in them. So if I say to a new student, if you're stuck with what does this phrasal verb mean, you've got no, you know, Wi-Fi's been cut off, you're just stuck in a room with a phrasal verb. What does the verb mean? Or what can the verb mean? Right, what does the preposition indicate about the action that the verb is talking about? And then maybe, just maybe, you can, you know, maybe from a choice of 3, you can whittle down which of those 3 it is. And that actually, if you cambiar el chip, as they would say in Spanish, and change your perspective a little bit, even the most absurd phrasal verbs begin to make a little bit more sense, and they're not quite so impenetrable. There's a really good, and again, we'll put the link on the phrasal on the show notes. A really good podcast by John McWhorter, who's a linguist at Columbia, who talks, and it's called "The Inner Workings of Out," and he talks about a whole load of phrasal verbs. And I've actually set C1 and C2 students to go away and listen to the podcast as a homework, you know, because he talks about this, that, you know, you take out the word out, lots and lots of phrasal verbs with out in them, but out is a direction. So pass out, for example. And you start thinking about what the verb means, you think about what the out means, and there's a kind of, okay, I can kind of see where the meaning comes from. So it's not a teaching solution, because you can't ask your C2 students to feel the correct meaning of a phrasal verb the way that we can as natives. But it's a technique for getting students to change the way they think about the language, because they see phrasal verbs and they think, oh, that's impossible, I can't do it. But actually, with some carefully chosen phrasal verbs that they may not have encountered before, that you can lead them towards understanding the meaning quite quickly because of breaking it down. I
think there's also a lot of research into, I think if you really want to nail phrasal verbs and make them natural, I mean, how many students, when you're having a conversation with them, like informally, I don't mean like, you know, when you're talking about a certain grammar point, how many actually randomly put phrasal verbs into their speech? I think I seen this. Yeah, I think I seen this. I was talking to, maybe it was a conference last year, and I was like making notes of just not just error correction and stuff, but just looking for little things, like little grammar points of how many times is this really said. And I think I only had about two C1 students who actually used phrasal verbs in natural speech.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of research that I was looking into this, and I think if you really want to master phrasal verbs and make them as natural as possible, I think the onus is actually on the student to get it themselves. Yes,
unfortunately.
yeah, but I don't mean. I mean, I remember having a student a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and he very, very strong student, got a massive score in the B2. He just walked C1 in his sleep, and he was like, "I want to learn the phrasal verbs." Like, it doesn't work like that. That's not going to happen. And he wanted like just pages and pages of phrasal verbs definitions. I'm like, no, you can't do that. A lot of the research actually points to the student taking it by themselves and learning through. I know there's the whole learning through reading. Context, but yeah, reading and watching native TV. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of research on doing English with friends, as in the TV show, as dated as that may be. But if you eat, doesn't matter what level you are. We always say watch something without subtitles to get the listening. But if you actually watch it with subtitles and look for phrasal verbs, you're gonna get a lot of them out of just natural speech.
I think we should probably move on to our next topic. But before we do, I also wanted just to throw a cat amongst the pigeons and say it's also important to remember why the students are learning English. And if this is a moment of global English and everything else, if they're not going to be speaking to native speakers of English,
the number of phrasal verbs they use is going to nosedive.
So in terms of them learning it, put that to one side. But in terms of them using it, because it is important. If you're speaking to native speakers, it does sound odd when you just use plain verbs and no phrasal verbs. But if you're not going to speak to native speakers, then the people you're speaking to aren't going to notice.
Yeah.
So your speech doesn't sound strange. And this is not. I don't want to get into the. Maybe World English is a question for another episode, but I don't want to get into that now. But I think stressing too much about our B2 teenagers learning mountains of phrasal verbs in case that one comes up on question 2 of the use of English, when I could be getting them to practice speaking and writing and using English more naturally, even if it doesn't sound like it's natural English to me, perfect English to me, I don't know that it's necessarily a problem if I'm spending more time on fluency than I am on phrasal verbs.
Yeah, I mean, as massive as the numbers are for the 3,000 possibilities and 5,500 international definitions, no one's ever going to learn them. I mean, you and me have different definitions.
We just had a conversation where we didn't understand each other. And if
exactly.
Case, and this is not to say that we shouldn't be holding our students to the highest possible standards, but at the same time, if we can be confusing each other as native speakers who only have a very small C between where we come from.
Who are both English teachers of experience as well.
I think we need to be a little bit realistic here about what's important. Phrasal verbs are important, and understanding them to get through exams is important. But beyond that, I think we have to remember that what students are learning English for.
It's communication. It's not be all and end all.
And speaking of communication, then I want to talk about pronunciation a little bit. Now, it doesn't matter what language you come from, you're going to find pronunciation problems in the language you go to. So I obviously had them in Spanish. Anybody who's tried to learn Spanish, an English speaker, will have encountered the double L sound, which is apparently impossible to get right if you're foreign.
It's the R, rolling your R's I can't do. I just can't physically do it.
We roll them in Welsh, so I have that as a gift. Yeah, the double R, the double L, the rolled R, these things confront us. So Spanish speakers obviously want to pronounce H's as the sound because they have nothing there in Spanish, so they try and contract the throat too much. S never comes before a consonant on its own, so we have to always have an E before the S in Spanish, so that then we end in English with a snake and a school and a sport. Which is a very common problem. We also have the problem of 5 vowel sounds, plus some diphthongs, but 5 pure vowel sounds. Coming across to English is, I don't know, how many is it, 4,612 vowels sounds? And they can't hear the difference. So that's one of the important points is, first of all, is that can they hear the difference? Because until they can discriminate the difference in their hearing, there's no hope of them pronouncing it. And that's why you have these wonderful exchanges between, no, the word is village. Yes, village. No, village. Yes, village.
Yeah.
Because the student simply isn't hearing that you're making a distinction between V and B, which might sound crazy, but unfortunately is exactly what's going on.
So the very first step is the hearing. Yeah.
Until they learn to discriminate, then there's not much point in going any further. But when we do go further, there's little tips and tricks. I find with the S, particularly with young students, but actually it works beautifully with a room of university-aged, often university students, asking them to pretend to be snakes. Maybe not on the first lesson with adults, but once they get to know you and know that you're crazy, it's fine. But yeah, what does a snake say? Well, a snake says S. It does not say S. So we have to be snakes first, and then we can say things like sport, and then finally we can say things like sport without saying a sport. So that's an important one. When it comes to what do you do with the H sound, Alan?
It's a political problem where I'm from.
I can ask that again because that is a far too niche joke for our podcast. What do you do with the H sound, Alan?
It's one of those things, like you said. I mean, you have to hear it before you can pronounce it. So I remember actually doing a university class where we had to take a hearing test before we could do the class, and everybody did the hearing test first. Which is actually it's a lot more important than you think, because how can you repeat something if you haven't heard it? But it's like the V and the B in the Spanish as well. Village, it's the same thing. You cannot repeat it unless you've heard it first. So actually, the more and more I think about it, the more that lecturer was right. When we should have done that hearing test first, and it actually paid off. Because you have to physically hear the thing first.
Yeah. I think the problem is that basically obviously there's too much constriction, and they produce this the jota sound that we have in Spanish. But actually, simply breathing out can get them to produce a H sound.
Yeah.
Stop trying. Stop pronouncing the letter, and then suddenly they can do it.
That's why you get things like doped.
Yes.
Very common, especially with the silent letters as well, because you see it and you automatically feel like you need to say it. Yeah.
Right, because in Spanish and in so many other languages, the letter being there means it gets pronounced. Whereas that's not the case necessarily with English.
Again, really importantly, it's going to change depending on L1 as well, because obviously we're coming from a Spanish background. When I was teaching in Arabic centres, very different again.
Of course, and again, that book that I referenced will be useful for that. And that was my next comment, was that actually I think this is about doing a little bit of investigation into the L when you're teaching, figuring out what the pronunciation problems are going to be, and then actually it's a little bit of your own self-development as well, like figuring out how are those sounds said. You might want to look at Robin Walker or Mark Hancock, both of whom have materials available online. They're certainly webinars with Robin Walker. I'd be surprised if they weren't available with Mark Hancock as well, although I haven't seen them as recordings. Both of whom talk about how sounds are produced, because unless you know how you're pronouncing a sound or how you're producing a sound in your mouth, it's been quite difficult to explain that to another individual. Mirrors are very important.
Well, that's a good point.
Or these days, selfie camera, I guess, so that people can look at what they're doing and see if what they're doing with their mouth is the same as what you're doing with your mouth. And recording is something I hadn't thought of until someone mentioned to me the other day, as this is how they'd learnt to pronounce better in English, was to simply record themselves and play it back, as unpleasant as that is for most of us, if not all of us, because you may think that you're producing the sound your teacher is producing, but it's all very well the teacher saying that's not the correct sound. But if you can't hear it back the way that somebody else is hearing it, it's difficult for you to produce the same sounds. So I think knowing the problems your students are going to encounter, knowing how you make those sounds, and then getting the students to do a lot of listening, not just to you and other native sources, but to their own language.
I think one of the really important things, and Robin Walker does talk about this as well, Because I was getting this wrong for years, and everybody was looking at me going, "You're pronouncing that word wrong," and I just couldn't work out why. Because in my head, I was saying it perfectly, and it wasn't until one of my Spanish teachers was like, "Okay, we're just going to work on this today and get it right. Where are you putting your tongue when you're saying that?" And I was, "What?" And it took me so long to realize my tongue position. No one had shown me the Spanish for where my tongue position in my mouth should have been.
Yeah.
And I was getting it completely wrong, and then I was like, okay, I need to think about where I'm putting my tongue to say that,
Yeah.
word.
Well, it's like,
oh, right, yeah.
It's like the V and the B, and the number of times I watch particularly younger students really struggle to produce a V sound because they simply aren't touching the teeth to the lip.
Yeah.
And I said, but Chico, I can't say that sound unless I do this. It's impossible. Like, why are you making it difficult? You have to, and so you get them to do it, and actually forget the word. Just put your upper teeth on your lower lip.
I remember. I think
now
when I was,
say it.
I think when I was in primary school, I remember my first teacher like trying to get all of us to pronounce the word "the." So I actually still do that with the young ones now to get them to pronounce "the" properly. Is like to stick their tongue out and do it "the" as if they're being rude. "The,"
absolutely,
and it works. They all think it's silly, and then to do it, they went, "Oh,
it's silly, but it's right." Another thing I quite like doing with adults actually is when we've in a particular lesson, if we've mastered the pronunciation of something. For example, I've managed to in a C1 room get everybody to pronounce a H nicely. And then, brilliant. Okay, we've all now said happy without any kind of sound. So that's it now. No excuses. And as you say, so it might be making them little kids laugh and feel silly, but also laughing is good when you're older as well. And go, actually, I can make this sound.
Yeah.
I have just done it perfectly. Prof said, well done. I can do this. Now, I know I'll get it wrong next time, but I know I have the capacity in me to produce it. And I think really, that's it. That sound there, that sound you just made is perfect.
Yeah.
You can do it. We'll keep working on it. It's really important.
I think you got to have a bit of fun with it because, I mean, it's so much easier when you've got a classroom, when you've got the rapport with the students. Because a lot of, especially adults, may feel quite awkward doing stuff like that. And it's only an eventual thing where they get it. And I do think listening's not enough. I mean, you gotta. I mean, I was getting the Spanish wrong a lot until somebody told me, no, just put your tongue there and you're fine. Oh, right, okay, that's better. Still can't roll me out.
So knowing how to produce the sound is a huge part of the battle. Right, prepositions.
Prepositions are a fun one. Prepositions are a fun one because you need to know the L1 as well for how they work. So
you say prepositions are a fun one. I refer openly to my students that prepositions are just evil.
No, I have that reserved for phrasal verbs.
In all languages, prepositions are evil because they really reflect the inner working of how the language sees the world.
Yeah.
So they don't connect.
Yeah, I think it's the same when you learn in Spanish, por and para.
That takes forever, and then once you have it, the distinction is so obvious. You can't believe you never knew it.
I know. Yeah.
Same with Sarah and Estad. I can't believe I ever didn't know whether to use Sarah or Estad.
Yeah, and then after a while, I mean, for all language learners, after a while, it does just sound natural. It's just that while is going to be a long while.
That long while, but with prepositions, that's prepositions of place, for example. You have to be physical.
Yeah.
You have to get them when they're young.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
And then you have to get them up on their feet doing stuff, either with their hands or moving things around, and actually seeing that English is putting a difference where Spanish doesn't. So in Spanish, we have en, and in English, we have in and on. And Spanish, despite being a wonderful language that I have an immense amount of admiration for some reason, can't distinguish between in and on, and I find that perplexing. So then we get wonderful sentences like, I was in the beach. Really? Under the sand? Oh, no. On the beach. But no, getting them when they're young, either with their hands against their bodies or with objects on tables or on chairs or on the floor, so that we're actually physically moving them around and seeing that English is giving space a different meaning to how Spanish does it. And really discouraging them from translating.
Yeah, because if you translate with prepositions, you're done.
Not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, one of the things I do with prepositions is a sort of preposition hand gesture. So on, under, next to, in, between, and all that. If you want the singy song, just go onto YouTube and look for in, on, under song. I could do that in my sleep. It's not going to be, even because I've just mentioned it there now, it's going to be in my head the rest of the day. It's a great song, but it works, especially if you get them. It's not enough just to simply watch a song and sing it. You have to do the hand gestures, because after a while, when you're talking to the little kids, you can see the cogs ticking over. And then I remember one of them was doing an exam one time, and he was actually doing the hand gestures I taught him. And I'm like, yeah, that's working. And he was getting them all right, but it was just funny the way it's just like we had the hand gestures with the prepositions. But it works.
Absolutely. And I think then with the older ones as well, and this kind of similar to what I was saying to do with pronunciation, is that you kind of have to do a little bit of language research if you don't know it already, and just, what do I mean with this preposition? Actually dispensing with any L1 of the student's knowledge, and just thinking, what do I mean when I use in? What do I mean when I use at?
I think one of the...
There's a clear distinction in English as to if I'm going to meet you at the station or in the station. But Spanish wouldn't do that. At least not in the same way. So they're always going to use in, even when they mean at. And it's like showing them, again, physically can be very useful. Yeah. But you have to, explaining with these older ones, drawing pictures, that kind of thing. But you have to know what the distinction is yourself first.
Yeah, I think if we were to sum up, you need to have, even if you don't speak the language of where you are, or if you're in an international classroom, it's probably would be a bit harder in an international classroom. But especially like if you're in Spain, you need to know, okay, from a Spanish perspective, it's this, even if you don't speak Spanish, or if you're from an Arabic perspective, it is this, or internationally, you gotta take it to how everybody can or might be able to interpret it. I think physical response is, even with adults, is doing the hand gestures and stuff is certainly the way forward.
I've done that with adults as well, especially B1 learners that need it. And I think, just as maybe a final thought on prepositions, it could be worse. Welsh prepositions of movement conjugate for the person.
Right.
So, to him and to her are not the same.
Okay.
Yeah. So, things could be worse.
Yeah. So they could be phrasal verbs.
They could. Things could be. Oh God. Prepositions and phrasal verbs. Shall we wrap up with the problems of word order, Alan?
We should. Yeah. Word order is one of those things.
By the way, wrap up as a phrasal verb that means finish.
Not here. No, it doesn't. Word order is something that the higher levels you go, the less it gets, or the less attention it gets, really. But in looking at a lot of academic writing at the minute, it can be a problem, especially if you're trying to, say, write academically for your C1 or something like that. Chris, your take on word order, higher, lower levels?
Yeah, I'm going to reference one of our earliest podcasts, translation. This obviously is going to work a lot better if you've got not an international room, but a monolingual class. But giving them a short text in their L1 and ask them to put it into English. I did this recently with a C1 and a C2 group, where I gave them, as I have used in the past, the first few lines of El Principito and got them to translate it into English. And there's a great example in the very first sentence. The object of the verb is on the second line of my handout because it's so far away in Spanish from the main verb of the sentence. And of course, therefore, when they translated it into English, the object of the verb was right at the end after all of the extraneous information that I didn't really have any interest in. And I sort of pointed this out, and we had this wonderful awareness-raising, noticing moment. Yeah, that's true. That does sound... And they could all see that it sounded weird, actually, because they're at that level. Yeah, that is odd. So then finally say, an amazing picture right at the end. And I'm like, yeah, where does it belong? I saw an amazing picture. Yeah, that does sound better. I saw an amazing picture in a book called. Yeah, sí, verdad. And I mean, does that mean that they've instantly improved their word? No, of course it doesn't. But a bit like they've all said H correctly, or they've all said the R correctly in a word. We've now raised the awareness. We know what we're talking about. We have a common reference point. You remember when we translated up? The word order. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to move those around. So I think translation can be really good for getting them to notice the differences between Spanish and English, or Thai and English, or German and English, whatever it might be. And that even at these levels, they're still thinking in their L1, and then they're iterating it into English.
Yeah. I think we should wrap it up there. We've already mentioned a couple of the problems, but they're big enough problems to cover for us.
They're pretty big problems.
They are.
Please do take a look at the show notes for any of those references. We'll put everything up there, because there is a wealth of information to help you out there.
Including details on our very first podcast from about a year ago, when we talked more about TESOL Spain and translation in the classroom.
It's true. Great. Well, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Phrasally Verbocious. If you'd like to get in touch, you can tweet us
at PhrasallyV on Twitter.
You can email us
phrasallyverbocious@gmail.com.
You can check out our show notes online at
phrasallyverbociouspodcast.blogspot.com.
And please like, review, and comment us on your podcast subscription service of choice. Goodbye.
Goodbye.